Ring of Pain is a really unique roguelite, and I also think it's underrated. Of course, it does also have some flaws, so let's get into it. Ring of Pain is a dungeon crawler card game roguelite fusion, and it feels novel. It's kind of like a reverse card game where you interact with cards, but don't create a deck of cards yourself. It's not really a deck builder. Basically, each turn you can do a couple things. You can interact with the cards in front of you, move through the cards to either side, or use one of your 2 spells. Interacting with cards is usually either attacking enemies or picking up items, potions, or chests, but there are a few other miscellaneous cards. You kill enemy mobs, gear yourself up with items, and get stat buffs that make you more powerful across your run. A lot of building up your equipment involves finding items with good stats and powerful extra effects. There are a number of build types or items that deliberately synergize with each other, such as multiple items that deal poison damage or interact with poison, for example. But you can also have a successful run with a more random mix of items. You don't have to get all items in a set to be successful. The core gameplay is easy to pick up, and the moves themselves aren't that complex. But the strategy and gameplay feel very different than games that I'm used to in a really enjoyable way. It was one of the few games that I played recently where it really took me a while to build up a viable run strategy because of how different Ring of Pain felt to other games. And that's really something that I enjoyed about the game, that novel feel, going into it and not really having a set idea of what the best way to win is. Part of this novelty comes from the game also making you consider alternative choices. So for example, while it's important to kill enemies to get souls, get this in-game currency, you almost never actually have to attack enemies, you never actually have to kill them. So there's a constant risk-reward mechanic going on with what choices you make, and it's important to know the limitations of your build and how to best use that. Additionally, while you have to climb through 16 normal rooms to get to the final boss, when you move between each level, you sometimes get access to intermediate themed levels or areas that I'll talk about more in the RNG section. Ring of Pain is also a fairly punishing game, and it's one of those games for where a lot of the time while you're playing through it, you're a couple bad turns away from losing a run. You'll die a lot, especially as you're still running the game, before you get the basic strategy down, but runs in Ring of Pain are also pretty short for roguelites. And even a full run beating the final boss only takes you like 20 to 30 minutes. And because the runs are so short, that eliminates some of that potential frustration from the punishing nature of the game because, while your run is over, you died, you lost your progress, you're losing less progress because you haven't invested as much time into each run. The shorter runs also make it a good roguelite if you're looking for quicker play sessions than a lot of other games in the genre that have longer runs. Also, as I do with every game that I really enjoy, I've been on the Ring of Pain subreddit, and the developers are pretty active in responding to comments, and they've also pumped out a lot of updates for the game after its release. The developers care, and that's always something to think about with these indie games. If the developers are positive, that's really a big plus of the game, and shows that it might improve even more in the future. I like to talk about randomness in roguelites, because it's a core piece of the genre that should provide freshness, but can also provide frustration instead. My opinion on the role of RNG in Ring of Pain has changed a lot as I played through it, but after playing through it more, I now think the RNG in Ring of Pain is mostly done well, but it has kind of a weird RNG curve. What I mean by that is, RNG has a really strong impact or making or breaking your runs very early on, but it matters less as you get later on to each run. When you're first starting each run, the placement of which enemies are where, whether you get decent items first, etc., are all super important for your early survival, and getting a few bad items can really tank your run early on. However, when this happens, the runs are often over in a minute or two, literally, so it's not as frustrating as getting to the final boss and realizing the randomness screwed you over there. On the other hand, when you get to these later stages, the randomness is just less important, mainly because there are more choices and more counter RNG measures you can use. So for example, when you open a chest, you can choose between 2 items or re-roll your item choices, get different items. When you're early on in a run, you often can't afford to re-roll your items at all, or if you can afford it, maybe not that many times. But as you get further on, you have a lot more souls to spend, so you can afford to buy that counter RNG measure and re-roll your items as needed until you get one that's helpful for you, whether it synergizes or just has good stats. Another nice area of variety are the intermediate special rooms between the 16 core levels. There are 25 different special room types, and it's fun to learn the different mechanics and themes for all of them. For example, some rooms have unique bosses, while another room has a timer mechanic that traps you into the room if you stay there too long. Which rooms you get on each run are randomly determined each playthrough, but you can always choose whether or not you want to go into each special room, and you often can choose between several special rooms on a given level. In addition to that, there are also 2 different endings and boss fights to the game, which adds a nice branching choice there as well. You can choose which type of boss fits your build better, or just which one you like better. However, all of these rooms, boss fights, etc., use the same core mechanics. You're still just interacting with these ring of cards, moving around each ring on each turn. So even though there are more pieces to consider, there are a lot of extra mechanics in these special rooms, these boss fights. It's not that different than the base gameplay. In terms of other sources of variety in RNG, the enemy pool isn't that big, so you get to know all the enemy types pretty quickly. And similarly, the item pool isn't that large either, but I'll talk later about how to unlock more items and those kind of things in the progression section. I think the smaller enemy and item pool both limit the replayability of Ring of Pain, but the variety is strong enough there to allow for, I would say, a medium amount of replayability. One thing that I do want to mention here is that the game does tell you the outcome of each of your moves before you do them. It doesn't account for certain possible RNG events, such as a critical hit or dodging an attack, but you'll never do worse than the displayed damage than the displayed effect. So you don't have moments where you're guessing, can I take this damage? Will I die here because of bad RNG? Those things don't happen. And that's definitely a positive of Ring of Pain because it takes out that annoying guesswork, that annoying, really potentially frustrating RNG that is present in some other games. So outside of the early areas where the importance of RNG is oversized, I think the game has a nice variety with this RNG and provides ample counter RNG measures for when you need them. You aren't hampered by getting bad items only. However, I do think the game would benefit from perhaps more enemy variety or more item playstyles that would give it even more replayability, move it to that next level. I also like to talk about progression in roguelites because that drives so much of their replayability. There are two main forms of progression: horizontal progression, which is progression that does not change the difficulty of the game in any way, and vertical progression, which is progression that does change the difficulty of the game, whether by making the game easier or making the game harder. In terms of pure horizontal progression, in addition to the base game mode, there are also daily runs. There are shorter games that have unique modifiers. This adds another way to play the game with unique strategies every day, leaderboards, those kind of things, which are more standard in a lot of roguelites nowadays. The second and larger form of horizontal progression are item unlocks. So as you play through the game, you unlock more items that you can then find on later runs. Unlocking these items mostly serves as a way to allow for more play styles. For example, by unlocking more and better stealth items, you now have more viable stealth builds. And unsurprisingly, some items are also just better than others. So there's some soft vertical progression there, but still the item unlocks are mostly variety, playstyle focused, and not a way of making yourself better across runs. These items are unlocked through specific achievements. You'll get most of them by just playing through the game. There are others that require specific planning, but they mostly aren't hidden or secrets. So by that I mean, you can see what the achievements are and immediately know what you need to do. You don't have to hunt around for a lot of hidden Easter eggs or search a wiki to find out how to unlock certain things. They're usually pretty obvious. I also think the pacing of these unlocks are actually quite well done because I unlocked most of them around the time where I was starting to really get the game when I wanted that variety, and I actually liked the process of unlocking them. It was like a fun little challenge instead of an artificial barrier. In terms of vertical progression, there are no power-ups, there are no buffs across run. You always start with the same weak base stats, and that never improves. However, in addition to the normal mode, there are two equivalent but different hard modes. Basically, to my best understanding, it's the same difficulty. Both hard modes are the same, but you can start with two different relics that lead to different starting stats and different effects, which lend themselves to slightly different playstyles. The game isn't very explicit in what the changes are between hard mode and normal mode, but from my experience, basically you get harder enemies early on in your run, and you get harder enemies, well, really throughout the whole run. Basically, it's the same mechanics, but harder. It's just a simple hard mode difficulty increase in that way. I actually think this hard mode is a really important addition to the game, since after the game really clicked for me, I've been able to clear runs pretty consistently, at least once I got past those few initial areas that are more RNG heavy, as I talked about earlier. This is definitely a game that has a bit of a learning curve, but it's also a game that once you kind of get it, once you understand what to do, it gets much, much easier. As a whole, these forms of progression make it an enjoyable game to play through, and I felt that progression had a nice pacing to it. However, while I had a lot of fun while playing the game, now that I can clear the game pretty consistently and have unlocked most of the items, I feel kind of done with the game for now. I'll definitely come back to it. I loved playing through it, but it just doesn't have quite the same level of replayability as some of the great roguelites out there, such as Slay the Spire or Hades. In terms of narrative or story, there actually is some story and world building in Ring of Pain. I was really drawn in and curious about this lore at first because the game sets it up really nicely. You run across these interactions with these two characters or primordial forces where they speak in cryptic and poetic lines, and that just really intrigued me. However, before too long, I had read all of the available lore and text lines, and so Ring of Pain joins the majority of roguelites as a game with some nice lore and world building, but it's just not a game you would really play for that story, that lore specifically. So what's my verdict on Ring of Pain? I think Ring of Pain is an underrated game. It's a really fun game, and it's also just a breath of fresh air because of how novel it felt because it's really different than a lot of other roguelites out there. I enjoyed going into a game where I didn't really have a lot of strategy coming in, but at the same time, the core gameplay wasn't confusing, hard to pick up, or overly complex. It was enjoyable even when I was bad at it. However, it does have its flaws. It suffers some from replayability and probably won't top the list of your most played roguelites. Additionally, it has a kind of weird RNG curve that ends a lot of runs early, but it gets more fair as the runs go further on. Because of these things, I would recommend it to people like myself who have played a lot of roguelites and want something fresh, want to try something new. I would also recommend it to people who want a more challenging and punishing turn-based roguelite. But I probably would not recommend it to people if you're the kind of person that wants to play one game and play it for 400 hours. You're just not going to do that with Ring of Pain. It doesn't have that replayability there. Please like this video to help me out, and thanks for watching.